جميل إن نستخدم التكنولوجيا الجديدة والحديثة اللي ممكن نطور عملنا وننتقل لمصاف الأندية أو لمستوى أفضل، خاصة اليوم الأندية الكبيرة على مستوى العالم قاعد تستخدم التكنولوجيا هاي. اليوم الإخوان شغالين مع مانشستر سيتي ودورتموند، أيضا بازل I think you work with بازل. هاي كل الأمور هذه أكيد يعني إحنا كمجلس البلد الرياضي سعيدين إن إحنا اليوم نعرض هذه الأمور هذه على أساس نطور من عمل أنديتنا وأكاديمياتنا الموجودة في بين دولة الإمارات. أتمنى إن شاء الله التوفيق للجميع. مشكورين.
I think an interesting point, so me and Mike have talked about this. So I was fortunate to work with Andy Robertson for 3 years at Hull City before he went on to Liverpool. We actually scouted Andy Robertson from one of the lower league Scottish teams. And there was no data available at the time on him. We had to send scouts, which cost us money, time, but it was worth it for us because he became a great player, played for us in the Premier League. And one of the things, and what Mike will discuss more today, is the Scottish FA saw problems like that they weren't identifying players like that. People from England, like Hull, we took their players they didn't see and made them into, so Andy is now the Scottish captain. I saw him at Liverpool a couple of months ago, and his development journey is different now to what the best Scottish players are doing, because since the Scottish FA and some of Mike's work, they've now created the Scottish Performance Schools, which Mike will go on to a bit more in detail and talk about how they then utilise technology to answer that problem.
Between Robertson, who went for free, 15 years old, and Tierney, who Celtic get 25 million for him to sell to Arsenal, there is a gap. Two talented players. One, they get good money from him, which is Tierney, and the other, they lost him early because of what? No program at that time, no solid program for improving talent. Or what? They both for Celtic, and they both same age, approximately.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say exactly because there are so many factors. But one thing that certainly didn't help was a lack of information. So, like Steve mentioned, when you go to watch someone like Andy Robertson, there's almost no information because he was playing in a level that was much lower. So I think it's an exercise where you need to decide which factors are important, and we're not exactly clear on what that is just now, but we're trying to find out by using sort of technical analysis, for example, but trying to understand which factors are important and then gathering good information on that over a longer period of time so that we can try and understand the patterns of what an Andy Robertson or a Kieran Tierney look like when they're 12, 13, 14. Is there anything that's an indication that they're going to then go on to be the ones who are sold for more money or play in bigger teams and win Champions Leagues and be the captain of the Scottish national team?
We know Scotland is very rich of oil and other things you know how to deal with. But how you deal with your talent, they are very important. They can make you a very good money, starting from Kenny Dalglish, who left Celtic in '77 to Liverpool, Graham Souness and others. Now, tell us about your program in Scotland using now to scouting, to improving talent and make them useful and very important for your country.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I suppose Scotland, in a sense, not too dissimilar to Dubai in that we have a very finite number of people to choose from. We're not blessed with a huge population. When you look at England or Germany or France, tens of millions of people, we can't afford to lose talent. So one of the things that's been set up in Scotland, it started in 2012, and it was the Performance School programme. Now, the Performance School programme is integrated into the high school curriculum. So it's not something that's revolutionary or brand new, but it was something that Scotland didn't have. And the interesting thing about the way that Scotland set the programme up was that it's run by the Football Association. So sometimes, for example, Liverpool, Manchester City, these bigger clubs, they are attached to their own private school. So it's the club that runs it. Whereas in Scotland, the Football Association run the programme, the players train within the programme every day, and then also train with their parent clubs in the evening. So the players' volume of training is increased quite remarkably. This happens at approximately 12 years of age and runs for 4 years. So it's the first year of entering high school, and the programme runs 4 years until they're 16 years old, in which by that time they maybe have been offered a full-time contract by their club. They may be staying on to engage in more education, or they may actually have been released at that point by their club, but they're not released by the Performance School programme. The programme itself was created after one of our sort of members of Parliament, Henry McLeish. He created a report that suggested we weren't doing enough to identify and to nurture talent. So this programme was set up to say, well, we need the best players in the country to play more football more often, so that ultimately the A squad, the senior team, can qualify for major tournaments, because qualifying for major tournaments makes you money, which you can then put back in the bottom to redevelop your talent ID pathways. So do you want me to talk about how they recruit the players for that?
Yeah, if we can just pause, please, Mike. Omar is going to translate some of this, and then we'll try and switch over back to the slides as well for you to talk around some of the slides you prepared as well. So thank you.
No worries.
اوكي حاول اترجم، يعني خلينا نقول ملخص. اليوم السؤال شو كان هو الدافع لاستحداث برنامج المواهب في اسكتلندا، وكيف تبعت خطوات خلينا نقول لهذا البرنامج. طبعا الاتحاد الاسكتلندي لاحظ انه في بعض الامثله للاعبين الموهوبين اللي خرجوا من فرق خلينا نقول بامكانات صغيره من اسكتلندا الى فرق بامكانات اكبر، وذلك بسبب عدم تحديد ماهيه خلينا نقول اللاعبين خلينا نقول اللي عندهم امكانات من عمر صغير. مثال على ذلك اللي هي ادم اندي روبرتسون. اندي روبرتسون لاعب
يسار ليفربول.
نعم، اندي روبرتسون لاعب اسكتلندي، كان يلعب في الدرجه الثالثه، فريق في الدرجه الثالثه. عندما خلينا نقول صار له اكتشاف لموهبته من فريق في انجلترا عن طريق هالت، ارسلوا كشاف لمتابعه هذا اللاعب. لم تكن هناك اي معلومات عن هذا اللاعب وامكاناته. هالت اخذوا اللاعب هذا، نموا المهارات، والان طبعا حنشوف تجربه هالت من خلال دكتور ستيف. نموا مهاراته وقدروا يوصلوا فيه لمرحله هنقول متقدمه. ولعلاج ذلك نحن عم نقول نحن المشكله والعلاج، نحن الهدف من هاي الجلسه نشوف شو المشاكل وشو حلولها بتطبيق عمل. فالاتحاد الاسكتلندي استحدث برنامج من عمر 12 سنه. هذا البرنامج حاليا يدار بشكل كامل من الاتحاد الاسكتلندي لكره القدم. لاعب بعمر 12 سنه يدخل في هذا البرنامج. طبعا نحن نتكلم عن الموهوبين، وباستخدام التكنولوجي وباستخدام العلوم الحديثه يتم اختيار اولا اللاعبين في هذا المركز. يتدرب اللاعب في المركز مركز الاتحاد الاسكتلندي، زائدا بروح المدرسه بشكل طبيعي. بعد المدرسه بروح على طريقه، بروح على الاكاديميه بشكل طبيعي. فهم خلقوا جو اليوم ل خلينا نقول سيطره وتطوير المواهب وعدم نزوف خلينا نقول المواهب من اسكتلندا والاستغلال خلينا نقول الامثل. نقطه مهمه جدا. ليش اسكتلندا اليوم تفرق عن خلينا نقول الانديه او الاتحادات الاخرى؟ هي ضعف خلينا نقول او قله الموارد او المواهب الموجوده في اسكتلندا. الخيارات من مش زي المانيا، مش زي مثلا هولندا، خيارات محدوده، ولذلك كان يجب عليهم استحداث برنامج للحفاظ على المواهب الموجوده عندهم لربط الانديه والمنتخبات.
للعلم فقط سكان اسكتلندا تقريبا 6 مليون، انجلترا 60 مليون، تقريبا دول ثانيه كنت تتحدث على المانيا في 80 مليون واكثر، فبالتالي كونهم 6 مليون فقط هذا يحدد الخيارات. الان نسمع له البرنامج اللي هذه تفاصيله. دكتور مايكل, can you tell us about your program, your regions, how you choose the players, train them? Tell us. We have the map here and all details.
Yeah, no problem at all. So, Steve, if you just go back one slide, sorry.
Yeah, no problems.
To show the map. Perfect. So
you need to help me just to give a break so I can translate after every slide.
Okay, no problem. All I was going to say was that is the map of Scotland. Those are the 7 regional centres. So there is a trial process for each region, and it has trial 1, where there is recreational players, so grassroots, lower level players, anyone can try out at all. It then goes to trial 2 in every region, where the successful players from trial 1 will join academy players, professional youth players, and then all the successful players from all 7 regions from that trial come together on one day for a national trial together to see who is going to be offered a place.
Okay, can you just give me a minute to translate?
Yeah.
Sure. So طبعا الخريطة هون تبين المراكز الموزعة في اسكتلندا. طبعا هالمراكز هي مقسمة إلى أكثر من قسم، في أكثر من مركز. منها اللي هي بسموها الجراس روت، اللي هي خلينا نقول المراكز البدائية أو مبدئية.
البراعم أو
مدارس براعم. منها يتم اختيار اللاعبين ليطلعوا على المراكز في المناطق، يعني اللاعب ما في داعي يسافر من مكان الى مكان حتى يلتحق في تدريبات الاتحاد. من المراكز المصغره يتم اختيار لاعبين الموهوبين، مش بس اختيارهم وتنميتهم، ومن ثم ينتقل للمرحله الثالثه. المرحله الثالثه اللي هي المراكز المتخصصه للاتحاد الاسكتلندي الموزعه على اكثر من منطقه في اسكتلندا.
Dr. Michael, sorry, before we go back to map, before we move, if there is a good player in Perth or Dumfries, how we go to the other to this center? Who drive him? Who take him?
Yeah, so it's very difficult, but some players will accept the place, and they maybe will take or be driven by their parents. They might get a train. The distance it's not a huge distance. You're maybe an hour and 20 minutes to go there and an hour and 20 minutes to come back. But that is a real challenge to try and incorporate all the players from around the country to the nearest centre. The association will subsidise some of the cost, not all of the cost, but they will subsidise some of the cost of the travel for players who live far away from the nearest centre.
Thank you. اخوان مثل ما سمعتوا، يعني انا تعمدت اسال هذا السؤال. في لاعبين في مدن تبعد عن المراكز ساعه ونص بالسياره. فكيف يروحون؟ قال اهاليهم يجيبهم بسياراتهم. الاتحاد الاسكتلندي ممكن يساعد ببعض المصاريف بس مش كلها. بس حتى تعرفون هنا ليش اهميه العائله، انه العائله لازم تساهم بعد، مش كله انه يقول لك جيبوا لنا اولادنا غدوهم جيبوهم اعطوهم فلوس اعطوهم كذا. العائلات هناك تدفع من بتحسب التطوير أولادهم. Yeah, we can go forward, sir.
I think Mike has discussed this already.
Yeah, so we can skip that one. Okay, so we wanted to talk about where we were faced with a problem. So in 2014, I started my PhD working with the Football Association, collaboration with the Football Association. And one of the things that they wanted to discover was the physical impact that all of this additional training was having. So they wanted to understand, if we are on the pitch much more, are we seeing accelerated physical adaptation compared to players who are not within the performance school? So that was, as a bit of context, that was 10 years ago, originally the question that they wanted to find out the answer to.
Yeah, I will give a conclusion after the slide. So go ahead. I'll give.
Okay, so if we skip forward, Steve.
No, you finish with this slide.
Yes.
اوكي طبعا هون اللي هي عم نتكلم على اللي هي الفلسفه اللي يشتغلون فيها في خلينا نقول المركز. الهدف الاول كان اللي هي يتكون خلينا نقول الفلسفه من البرنامج خلينا نقول البرنامج البدني، الاختصاص البدني طبعا، واللي هو كان خلينا نقول التركيز عليه كان بالفتره من 10 سنوات هلا اللي هو الاساس في عالم كره القدم.
Thanks. So the way that we use technology in this instance to try and gather some information about the players who were in the program compared to the players who were not in the program was we looked at the factors that we considered to be important for success in youth adolescent footballers. So we collected information on their stature, their mass, their sort of body composition, and we tried to estimate things like biological maturity. So that was just purely from a physical perspective. We then looked at physical attributes that are considered to be important for success in football, such as how fast you can run, how quickly you can change direction, how powerful you are, how fit you are, your endurance levels. And then we also tried to gather some information about how much time the players were spending on the pitch. And we collected that data over a 2-year period right across Scotland from top to bottom, 7 performance schools, and also used 3 control groups within that research.
طبعا كان التركيز اللي هي مقارنه او جمع المعلومات عن اللاعبين لمده خلينا نقول 3 سنوات تقريبا، ومقارنه اللاعبين خلينا نقول المعلومات اللي تجمع عن اللاعبين اللي هي الوزن، السرعه، تحمل، كم اللاعب يقدر خلينا نقول يكمل في الميدان في المباراه في التمرين، زائدا مقارنه اللاعبين الموجودين داخل المركز باللاعبين الموجودين خارج المركز، ليتاكدوا انه نحن اليوم عندنا صفوه لاعبين من ناحيه اللي هي البدنيه. Go ahead.
So that posed us with a further problem. So even with the outcome of that research, what it seemed to tell us was that despite the fact that players were on the pitch much more often, they were playing much more football, that physically the additional training didn't seem to accelerate physical development. So they're playing more football, they're on the pitch more often, but they are not getting faster, fitter, more powerful, or more aerobically capable than players who are not doing that. It's not happening at a faster rate. So that posed the problem, well, what is the program actually for? If we're spending all that money and all that time, what is the program actually for? And that led us to where we are now, which is to try and quantify technical prowess. Okay, because that's something that's been very, very difficult in the past, It's been very time consuming, maybe up until 5-6 years ago when technology like PlayerMaker didn't exist. Technical analysis came from videoing training or video of games, and then hand notation or electronic notation from an analyst. So very, very time consuming, very difficult to do, but posed us with a very interesting next step in this problem.
اوكي، طبعا من خلال العمل اللي تم وجدوا انه في مشكله من خلال مراجعه خلينا نقول الداتا والتقارير، انه اللاعبين اللي داخل البرنامج بالنظر لكميه التمارين اللي يقومون فيها والتدريبات والبرامج الموضوعه فيها، ما كان في تطور كبير بين اللاعبين الموجودين داخل المركز واللاعبين اللي يلعبون خارج المركز. فكان السؤال، طب احنا شو الهدف من البرنامج؟ شو اللي احنا بدنا نحققه اذا اليوم لاعب يتدرب بكل هالتمارين ما عم بيقدر يحقق اضافه المرجوه بالسرعه المطلوبه؟ يعني انا اليوم اذا اللاعب هذا بيتدرب بالاسبوع صباحا مساء، المفروض يكون الاكسلريشن او تسارع عمليه التطور اكثر من لاعب موجود خارج المركز. فهنا طرح سؤال، ما هو الهدف من البرنامج وفائده صرف كل خلينا نقول الامكانات على هيك برنامج؟ Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you. So that was the problem before. We weren't able to quantify technical performance, and we now understood better that physical performance wasn't being accelerated by the program. So one thing we wanted to do now was set about trying to see the impact that technical performance had. So we thought the best way to do that would be to go right to the start at the very beginning, where we're actually recruiting players into the program. Okay, so we created a partnership with the Football Association and PlayerMaker, and we went to the national trial, like I spoke about earlier, the final trial, where players will either be offered the position within the program or they will be unsuccessful. And we did a number of different tests. So we had the same idea on the left-hand side. We had the test battery, which was isolated, speed, agility, power, and then size, weight, and so on. But now we had PlayerMaker, and we were able to examine how many touches the players took, how many times they released the ball, how many times they released the ball at a high speed, the average time that they spent on the ball, and the average time per possession. Okay, so that was our technical analysis during the trial. And then physically, we were also able to get in-game data in terms of how far the players had run, the distance that they ran at a high speed, how often they accelerated, and how many times they decelerated. And these are all physical and technical parameters that we understand from the evidence are important for success in football.
نعم. طبعا الجواب كان انه نحن اليوم عم نطلع على جهه واحده من المعادله اللي هي الناحيه البدنيه. فكان خلينا نقول نتيجه البحث انه لا، احنا لازم نركز على الجانب التقني والجانب اللي هي البدني، زائدا اللي هي جانب السرعات وفحص اللاعبين ل خلينا نقول الماكسيموم. ومن هنا بدا البحث بين اللي هي الاتحاد الاسكتلندي واكثر من شركه اللي بتقدر تقدم هيك نقول خدمات، وكان الاختيار لشركه PlayerMaker. طبعا في اكثر من شركه بتقدم هذا المجال، لكن واحده من الشركات اللي هم اختاروها لهدف انه نحن اليوم بدنا نعمل اختبارات لكم لاعب كم لمس، كم مره بلمس الكره، عدد الباسات، سرعه اللاعب في تمرير الكره، كم بيستحوذ على الكره، زمن الاستحواذ، زائدا اللي هي الفيزيكال بارت او البدني، المسافه المقطوعه، الهاي انتنسيتي اللي هي الجري في معدل عالي، التسارع والتباطؤ، بالاضافه للاختبارات اللي هي البدنيه في بدايه المرحله اللي هي التحمل، الجري في الجري السريع، بالاضافه ل خلينا نقول الكي بي اي الاخرى او القياسات الاخرى. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so this is just a quick picture of what the national trial looks like. It was split into two parts. There was a morning session and an afternoon session. The morning was very subjective about coaches' opinions. They simply just watched the players play a game, they watched technical practice, and then we carried out the isolated physical test battery. The afternoon was games, 9 versus 9, playing games, no coaching, and that was where we took the technical and physical match data from. So that's just a picture of the setup from the national trial.
Yeah. Let me just translate because this is very important. طبعا هذا هو خلينا نقول برنامج التدريب او اللي هي برنامج خلينا نقول اختيار اللاعبين المنتخب. كان مقسم الى فترتين، الفتره الاولى الفتره الصباحيه اللي هي تتضمن سبجكتيف اللي هي خلينا نقول راي مدرب بشكل محايد عن اي تكنولوجيا يستخدموها. كان مقسم اللي هي بدني تست باتري او اللي هي بالعربي ما نعرف يعني خلينا نقول، لكن خلينا نقول السرعات القصوى او المقدره القصوى للاعب اللي بيسموها تست باتري بالانجليزي، زائدا مباراه بعدها يقيم المدرب اللاعبين تقييم بشكل يدوي وبنحط التقارير. في الفتره المسائيه كان عباره عن مباريات يستخدم فيها التكنولوجيا لاعطاء تقارير بشكل اوتوماتيكي عن اللاعب من الناحيه البدنيه والناحيه التقنيه بدون اختيار بدون تدخل مدربين.
Thanks. So one of the things that was highlighted 10 years ago, and I don't know how much you already know about this, but the relative age effect and birth date distribution was something 10 years ago that we found the Scottish FA were notoriously bad at. So we really had a very strong relative age effect, and that means that disproportionately the majority of the players being picked to join the program were from the first quarter of the year. So if you look at that on the left hand side, that is January, February, March, second quarter, April, May, June, third quarter, so on, and then fourth quarter, so on. It used to run like a slope. So it used to be lots of players from the first quarter and then hardly any players from the fourth quarter. Now, partly the explanation of that is talent identifiers, coaches, scouts, mistaking advanced anthropometric measures, taller players, bigger players, biologically more mature players, and mistaking this for talent. So they watch the player and they think they have a great impact, but really it is sometimes simply because they are bigger. Now, in this instance, what we were very happy to find out is that the players who were selected or were successful for the performance school trial recently are actually very similar distribution to the players that were presented on the day. So the black graph at the top is the whole population, everyone who was at the trial. The green graph on the left, the successful players, is very similar to that distribution. So we were very happy with that because we didn't want the distribution to be skewed with lots of quarter one players. And then the unsuccessful players, again, there's no real skewed distribution. It's fairly flat in that there's no discrimination of your selection based on the month you were born. So we were happy with this finding.
نعم. طبعا ممكن يعني هاي يساعدني فيها الكابتن، لكن من 10 سنوات كانت خلينا نقول اختيار اللاعبين خاصة في المراحل اللي هي النهائية بتتم على الأكبر الأقوى الأسرع، فكان عامل العمر هو العامل الأساسي في اختيار اللاعبين حسب ما وجدوا بالدراسه. وجدوا انه اللاعب اللي بيولد في خلينا نقول اول 4 أشهر من العام هو عنده قوه بدنيه، او خلينا نقول البناء الجسمي تاعه متطور اكثر من اللاعب اللي يولد في اخر السنه. فلما يجي اختيارات الفئات السنيه مثلا للعمر مثلا 2005 دائما، او خلينا نقول في عمر اصغر، يعني بيكون عمره 12 سنه بده يكون اليوم مواليد خلينا نقول 2000 ممكن 16 او 17
مواليد 2011.
فبتلاقي اللاعب المولود في اول السنه له حظ اوفر باختياره لانه الامباكت تاعه في الملعب اكبر. طب شو صار عندنا احنا خسرنا مواهب اخر السنه، لا هو لعب في العام اللي يلي ولا لعب في العام اللي هو المفروض يلعب فيه. فهنا بلشت الدراسه انه نحن كيف تصير التكنولوجيا هي معيار ليعطيني اسس اختيار اللاعب وليس عين المدرب او راي المدرب. طبعا راي المدرب اساسي، لكن هل نحن بنقدر ندخل التكنولوجيا لنعطي بعد اخر لاختيار اللاعبين وعدم خساره المواهب اللي عندنا؟
يعني باختصار عفوا، مواليد 2011 هذه البطوله لمواليد 2011 اللي مولود بشهر 1 عمليا راح يكون اكبر من اللي مولود بشهر 12 نفس السنه، اكبر منه ب 11 شهر، فجسمه حيكون نامي اكثر. ونفس الشيء اللي موالد شهر 2 اكبر من اللي موالد شهر 11، اكبر منه ب9 شهور، بس هو نفس الفئه، فحصل عنده ادفانتج بدني.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. So now if we look at the matches that were played, so the 9 versus 9 games, and we look at the physical characteristics of the players or the physical demands of those games, and we split the players from those who were successfully offered places in the programme compared to those who were unsuccessful at being offered a place, we can see that on average, the successful players outperformed the unsuccessful players in all metrics. So the successful players on average ran further, they were able to cover a greater distance at high intensity, they carried out more accelerations and more decelerations. And in the instance of the high intensity distance and the accelerations, they covered significantly more. Now, those two are particularly important because the important parts of football are the parts that happen at high intensities. High intensities are where goals are scored, possession turns over, you win and lose individual battles. These occur at high intensity. So those two were particularly important. But successful players outperforming unsuccessful players on every metric.
نعم، طبعا هنا الدراسه تبين انه كيف اليوم عملوا دراسه الداتا والمعلومات اللي اجت بين اللاعبين اللي تم اختيارهم واللاعبين اللي هي ما كانوا موفقين في الاختيار، وجدوا الداتا تقول انه اللاعبين المختارين هم افضل من اللاعبين اللي خلينا نقول تم استبعادهم من القائمه.
So because of time, I'm just messaging Mike. The idea is that we'll go very briefly through these, but then we'll skip to your main findings, Mike, if that's okay.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute there. Yes, no problem.
So again, very briefly, they found that all the technical measures as well, there's a shift in the more successful players across the board, and this correlated with what they were seeing within the physical testing.
نعم، طبعا وجدوا كمان انه اللاعبين تم اختيارهم تكنيكالي كمان، مقارنه من الناحيه التقنيه ومقارنه من الناحيه اللي هي خلينا نقول الفيزيكال هاي فيزيكال.
يعني عفوا، عين المدرب مش هي الاخيره، طابقوا اللي اختاروهم واللي ما اختاروهم بالاداء والتقنيات، لقوا اللي اختاروهم فعلا هم افضل حسب الكمبيوتر، فبالتالي لم يكن راي المدرب متعجرف، لا، بعد الاختيار ايضا تمت مقارنه.
So Mike, what were the main findings from your project, please?
Yeah, so the really interesting thing about this was that the coaches didn't use any of the data to pick the players. So we collected all the data. The coaches then went and made all their decisions, subjective, their opinions. They picked the players, offered the places, and then we looked at the data. So when we looked at the data, we were able to see that coaches, by watching the games, were able to see the players who took the most touches, who released the ball most often, who ran the furthest, who covered the most high intensity distance. They were able to subjectively see, more than likely, the players who were impacting the game the most. Now, the really important part of that is that when we looked at successful versus unsuccessful, none of these differences appear to be caused by size or mass or biological maturity. The two groups are practically identical with regards to anthropometric measures. So that was really important, because we knew then that the coaches weren't simply picking the biggest, fastest, tallest players who could kick the ball the hardest. They were picking the players who had these characteristics, but it wasn't because they were simply bigger or older. Now, another thing that we sort of concluded from this was that when we isolated physical performance, we saw that the successful players performed best. Now, that would then beg the question, why are you doing isolated physical performance when the gameplay, the match play, is also showing you that the players who are successful perform physically the best? So it would make sense then that instead of having sprint tests, jump tests, change of direction and so on, that we simply play more games and we see players in the environment that we want them to be good in, and we take physical and technical data from match play and use that information instead of boring physical tests that nobody really wants to do, especially for young children.
يبقى هو في الآخر بدل القيام بعمليات قياس لياقة مملة، اقفزوا اجريوا ويقارنون، بدأوا يربطون أدائهم البدني والفني أثناء المباراة. فتلعب مباريات أكثر، أثناء المباراة يقيسون أدائك، الجري، سرعتك، مهارتك مع بعض، ويطلعون بحصيلة واحدة بدل إجراء قياسات بدنية منفصلة عن القياسات الفنية.
وصار للمدرب وقت اكبر ودور اكبر انه يطالع الاولاد او اللاعبين ويشوفهم اثناء اللعب، بدل ما انا اخذ اسرع لاعب بالسبرنت، انا اليوم عم باخذ اسرع لاعب بالكره. فصار في تماثل بين راي المدرب او عين المدرب اثناء اللعب مع الداتا اللي تم اخذها بعين الاعتبار. مايك.
Last slide.
So this is now, as a result of the findings, this is now what we have done. So this year, just in March, we removed the physical test battery. We took that out and decided that we were no longer going to isolate physical performance. We wanted to simply see how fast the players could run. So we did 3 30-meter sprints with the player maker units on. So the players wore player maker and they completed just on the blank pitch 3 30-meter sprints, so we were able to see a top speed from the players. We've provided also the coaches with feedback regarding their choices and how we were able to avoid the uneven distribution from the relative age effect, and that is being reinforced through coach education to encourage coaches to look beyond physical prowess and stature. And then what we're going to do next, and this is a project that Steve and I are working on together, is to try and examine whether on the day of the trial, if your team's success is indicative of how likely you are to be selected. So if you are by chance put in a good team on the day, are you then more likely to be picked? And we want to understand that, because if that is the case, then it's possible players are being wrongly selected into the programme. For example, we might be taking on players simply because on the day they played next to other good players. and we want to avoid that where possible. We want to try and make sure that we are selecting the correct players. But this is going to take a number of years. It's not going to happen quickly. We only understand at the moment the short-term success. So I use the word success very lightly. We only understand the short term of this. We have to wait longer and continue to collect data every day using PlayerMaker and the Performance School programme to try and examine the trends. So what are the trends in the players who are then going on to be Nathan Patterson, Billy Gilmore, Andy Robertson, Kieran Tierney and so on? What do they look like at 12 and 13? And how do we best support their development through to senior football?
Okay, Mike. So that's really interesting. طبعا البرنامج اللي هي بناء على المعطيات اللي تفضل فيها مايك في البدايه، صار في تعديل على طريقه نقول عمل الاختبارات والقياسات. تم نقول اخراج الفحوصات البدنيه من الاختبارات واستعاضوا فيها ب 33 متر جري سريع او سبرنت ببدايه التمرين باستخدام اجهزه خلينا نقول البلاير ميكر، وصار يعتمدوا على مباريات اكثر لاختيار اللاعبين، يحطوهم في جو المباراه ويختاروا بناء على لعب اللاعب. الامر الاخر اللي هي نقول تطوير المدربين واعطائهم دورات لتجنب خلينا نقول التركيز على الجانب البدني واغفال عن خلينا نقول اللاعبين اللي في اخر السنه، زي ما بيقولوا النظر الى الصوره الكبيره وليس فقط الى خلينا نقول عامل واحد. زائدا اليوم في لاعبين ممكن ما يكون في يومه فانت اليوم لما تحط اللاعب في مباراه مباراتين 3 مباريات 4 مباريات، ممكن تغيير اللاعبين الموجودين معه يعطي خلينا نقول نتائج افضل. هذه هي خلينا نقول خلاصه الدراسه. بيقول مايك انه اليوم الدراسه هاي مش يوم او يومين، هي خلينا نقول مشروع طويل الامد ل خلينا نقول تطوير الكره في اسكتلند باستخدام التكنولوجيا جنبا الى جنب مع المدربين وتطوير المدربين. دائما نحكي في عاملين، عامل تطوير بشري زائدا تكنولوجيا. التكنولوجيا ما تقدم لك كل شيء اذا ما كان عندك خلينا نقول كفاءات والعلوم اللي تقوم بدور تحليل واعطاء المعلومه.
We just say thank you to Mike. First of all, please.
Well, next time we will see you here in Dubai in winter, not in summer.
He will know.
Let's hope so. I think by that time I'll have moved from long sleeves to short sleeves to vest.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It was lovely to talk to you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, Naomi.
Hiya.
We were north in Scotland. Now we go south to England.
Yes.
What do you say about your program for scouting for talent, improving those young talent?
So in terms of my project, it's in the women's game in England. So we are investigating training and match characteristics across the women's first division, second division, and the academies of those first division teams as well. So we have 25 teams involved in the project across the last 3 years, which we are researching across from the FA perspective.
So Naomi works within the English FA that is trying to investigate how they can improve the levels from academy football to the senior level as well, and looking at that transition as well. So it'd be good just to get a detailed, Naomi, of what have been the biggest performance challenges as part of your project and how the FA have gone about trying to answer these performance questions.
Yeah, so because of the scale of the project and the fact that we were trying to run this within female players, we had an issue in terms of resource. So as the FA, we wanted to try and investigate across the range of the leagues so we can try and optimize that progression between those leagues. First thing we needed to do was kind of identify what technology were we going to use to try and collect the data that we needed in terms of physical, match and training data. So we did an audit of what technology clubs were using across the Women's Super League, which is the top league, the Women's Championship, which is the second league, and of course the Women's Super League academies as well. We found that actually there was a mix, so teams were using different technologies and some teams had no technology at all. And that was a problem for us because when we're collecting data in terms of research or even for kind of practice, we need to be able to use the same technology so we can compare across teams from an FA perspective as well. So our main performance challenge was how can we get everyone using the same technology and what technology should we use? So that's where Playmaker comes in. And luckily Playmaker partnered up with us at the FA and Leeds Beckett University to provide Playmaker units in the system for every team involved within the project. So that meant that every team was using the same system, so they have the same data, and we were able to compare between teams and across leagues. So it meant that we could provide feedback to those clubs where they sit compared to a league average, and also for the FA, as well as the national governing body, they could see where each league was sitting and which teams and players within those leagues were performing better than those other players. So that was our first performance challenge.
We'll just let Omar translate if that's okay, Naomi.
Sorry, I have a very short memory, so I'm getting old. طبعا نومي مايهل هي مسؤولة في اتحاد الإنجليزي لكرة القدم في الكرة النسائية. بتعمل بمجال تطوير الكرة في مختلف الأعمار السنية وبمختلف الدوريات. كان المشروع طبعا الهدف الأساسي منه هو تقييم خلينا نقول اللاعبين بمختلف الأعمار، تقييم الأندية وتقييم الدوريات ومقارنة خلينا نقول علمية بين مختلف خلينا نقول هاي اللاعبين للخروج بمعطيات تعطي انديكيشن او بوصله وين احنا ماشيين في كرة القدم في انجلترا. طبعا ضعف الموارد بالنسبه لهم ككره نسائيه، ضعف الامكانات اللي هي مشابهه خلينا نقول لبعض خلينا نقول الدول عندنا في كره القدم الرجاليه للرجال عفوا. ف بدأت بتحليل خلينا نقول ودراسة التكنولوجيا المستخدمة في الأندية وفي فرق داخل الأندية، يعني عندك نفس النادي عنده أكثر من نوع من التكنولوجيا. فقرر خلينا نقول الاتحاد الإنجليزي اختيار واحدة من الشركات اللي بتعطي بعد يمثل، احنا يعني دائما نرجع للنقطة الأساسية. السؤال اللي نحن او ما الهدف من البرنامج اللي نقوم فيه؟ هل هو الهدف فقط بدني؟ هل هو هدف تقني؟ هل هو هدف تكتيكي؟ وهنا تم اختيار طبعا شركه بلاير ميكر ل اساس تكون لهي الدراسه، طبعا بالتعاون مع البرنامج البحثي في الجامعه لاعطاء كل فريق خلينا نقول جهاز القياس اخراج مخرجات متشابهه لحد خلينا نقول لحد كبير متماثله ليكون القرار كلير. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So I suppose coming on to the next kind of thing while we get the slides up, please, as well, is it'd be good to hear and understand a few case studies from what answers you found as part of your problem solving with these performance questions, if that's okay.
طبعا الهدف هو احنا بندخل بصلب الموضوع اللي هي اعطيني دراسات حقيقيه، اعطونا امثله حتى نقدر احنا نستفيد منها في مجالنا.
Yeah, so just to repeat, our performance question was we're trying to optimize the physical development of our elite players so they are prepared for the demands of the game. And so we're using PlayerMaker and the physical data from PlayerMaker to establish where teams are sitting in terms of those physical characteristics. So first season of the project, as you can see on the slide on the screen, we collected training data across the top 2 leagues, which is Women's Super League and the Women's Championship. And we did also collect training data from the academies as well in the subsequent season. So using PlayerMaker and the technology, we found that WSL players complete more high intensity actions during training compared to championship players. And so in particular, we're looking at the graphs in the middle, which shows high speed running. So the purple line is Women's Super League, which is the top league. Pink line is Championship, which is the second division. So we can see that across matchday -4, that's where we see the largest differences in high speed running between competitive levels. So overall, we found that matchday -4 is a key day that discriminates between the competitive levels, and that's for high speed running, sprinting, acceleration and deceleration as well. So we fed that back to clubs essentially and said, you know, if you're a championship club and you want to mimic what's happening in the top league, then perhaps matchday -4 is a key day where you can increase your kind of extensive work within training. That's point 1. I'll give you a chance to translate that.
اوكي that's easy one. طيب باختصار بس طبعا تمت الدراسه على اللي هي السوبر ليج في انجلترا زائدا اللي هي WCD is not
WSL Women's Super League.
لا the next one
Super League, yeah, and the Championship.
هي البطوله المحليه. وجدوا انه اداء الفرق في خلينا نقول في السوبر ليج هو اعلى من اداء الفرق في الشامبيونشيب ليج. فمن خلال الدراسه على اكثر من المعطيات اللي هي المسافه المقطوعه، السرعات، وجدوا انه ماتش داي نمبر 4 اللي هي اليوم اللي هي خلينا نقول 4 ايام قبل المباراه، التمرين اللي يتم في اللي هي سوبر ليج اعلى من خلينا نقول التمرين اللي بيقوموا فيه بالشامبيونز ليج في البطوله المحليه. وهنا كان هو فرق خلينا نقول نقطه الحسم، ان اليوم اذا الفرق في البطوله المحليه بدها تطور حالها زي سوبر ليج لازم يشتغلوا على الماتش داي -4. اوكي مايك؟
Fab. Okay, so the next point that we found in terms of the training data was when we looked at acceleration and deceleration distance. The Women's Super League did cover greater acceleration and deceleration distance compared to the Championship, but actually that distance was really small when we look at the whole session across each training day and across the week. Teams and players were having really low levels of acceleration and deceleration exposure, less than 1% of kind of the entire session distance. So that's not really enough to be an exposure to high intensity acceleration and deceleration. So we fed this back to coaches and practitioners and suggested that they could increase the exposure to acceleration and deceleration by increasing the variability throughout the training week. So it might be that a match day -4 is low exposure, but a match day -3 would be high exposure. So within periodization of a training week, they are moderating and manipulating how much acceleration and deceleration players are exposed to, because at the minute, there's no real variation there. It's very low across every day within the training week.
طبعا خلينا نقول العامل الاخر اللي تمت متابعته اللي هو التسارع والتباطؤ في التمارين. وجدوا انه اليوم اغلب خلينا نقول العمل بيتم كمان بماتش داي -4 او اللي هي اليوم اللي يسبق المباراه ب4 ايام. فكانت المقترحات انه اليوم انت وزع الجهد هذا على الاسبوع بحيث يعطي مردود افضل لا خلينا نقول التولينج. طبعا انت بتشوف في فرق بسيط بين الدوريين، لكن بالمجمل جهد غير موزع بشكل متساوي بين خلينا نقول ايام تدريب. Go ahead.
Yeah, so off the back of that as well, there was a couple of clubs in particular where they noted that they were below the league average in terms of high speed running and sprint distance within sessions. Clubs had access to this data throughout the season, so we were able to share that with them. So we then gave them some ideas in terms of how to increase that high speed running exposure based on the data that we have. So they increased their pitch size during training. So they were only training on a half pitch, but they then increased to a whole pitch size of training, which means if you've got more space, players have more distance to reach a higher velocity. And so by doing that, we then looked at the data in the following weeks and found that they had increased their high speed running exposure and they were now above the league average. So that was a positive example within the season where our research has helped impact a club on the ground. And this slide here just shows our drill demand findings for each league. So we got each practitioner, they tag their drills. So you have all the different drill types that you would have in a session. So it might be small-sided games, possession drills, technical drills, tactical drills, and conditioning drills. And as you can see on the slide, we've got the Women's Super League, the Championship, and the Academy. And that figure shows the proportion of each drill in terms of the total duration of a session. So the largest duration was spent in technical and extensive small-sided game drills. And that was the same for all three leagues. So technical drills is the pink colour, the extensive small-sided games is the purple colour. So we can see across all three leagues, most duration is spent in those two drills. So those two drills become quite important within training.
طبعا الدراسة أيضا بيّنت إنه زي ما قلنا في البداية إنه في تفاوت بين أرقام الفرق من عملوا خلينا نقول تحققات أو الدراسات وجدوا إنه بعضها بيرجع لحجم الملعب. فرق اليوم تتدرب على ملعب صغير معناته الفيزيكال بريباريشن او التحضير البدني تاعه حيكون اقل. وهي بجوز نقطه احنا تكلمنا فيها دكتور عدنان من قبل يعني في اكثر من مجال انه انت اليوم عشان تطور الجانب البدني لازم تعطي مساحات اكبر للاعبين ليبنوا هذا المجال. الموضوع الاخر انه وجدوا انه الجانب التقني او التدريبات التقنيه مع المباراه تشكل اكبر قدر ممكن اكبر مساحه من التمارين. فاليوم انت اذا ما قدرت تحط برنامج تدخل البدني داخل التقني اليوم انت عم تخسر جزء من تطوير اللاعب بدنيا. طبعا بعد ما مرروا المعلومات هذه للفرق وجدوا في تحسن كبير في الجانب البدني للفرق وصارت خلينا نقول مقاربه لسوبر ليج. طبعا المعلومات هاي اللي جمعوها كانت ترسل الى الفرق وليست تحصر داخل الاتحاد، فكان يعطى للفرق خلينا نقول ارقام اللي لازم يحققوها في التمارين لا يوصلوا الى المرحله خلينا نقول المطلوبه. وهي واحده من الامور اللي احنا عم نتكلم فيها بجوز مع المجلس ومع نقول اغلب الانديه حاليا كيف نقول تطوير داخل التمرين لرفع الكفاءات التقنيه والبدنيه. Go ahead.
Great. So in addition to that, in terms of the different drills, we actually found that practitioners were making drills longer or shorter. That's what was causing the differences in the physical and technical characteristics that we've seen, rather than actually changing the intensity of the drill. And so that likely leads back to what we found in terms of acceleration and deceleration, where there was really low levels of that throughout the training week. And it may be because practitioners are, instead of just changing the intensity, so that instead of changing the pitch size or the number of players, they're just increasing or decreasing the length of the drill. So that changes the volume rather than the intensity. So that's something that we've fed back to teams within the project is, can coaches add players, remove players, increase or decrease pitch sizes?
اوكي طبعا الامر الاخر اللي وجدوه من خلال التمرين تمارين انه زمن التمرين بيختلف من نادي الى اخر. النادي خلينا نقول الزمن الفعلي للتمرين، وكأننا نحن نتكلم عن دراسه صايره عندنا في دبي مش في مكان ثاني. بقول لك انه اللي وجدوا انه زمن اللي بياثر على الارقام وتطوير الجانب البدني هو المده الحقيقيه للتمرين والفعليه. فاللي عمل انه زادوا التمارين او كفاءه التمارين في الزمن، وجدوا انه فيها تحسن في الجانب خلينا نقول التسارع والتباطؤ زائدا الجانب البدني. فكل ما اعطيت تمرين بمده اكبر للولد كل ما هو طور بشكل اكبر.
So Naomi, again, thank you, and just conscious of time, sorry. So there's been some really good findings from your project, as you've shown. Like, can you just go into a bit more detail about what you're now doing with the peak match demands to try and help get better practice for the practitioners within the football clubs, please?
طبعا السؤال ممكن نستخدم البيانات اللي جمعناها اللي هي خلينا نقول الاعلى البيانات لا نقدر احنا نحسن الاداء. Go ahead.
Yeah, so essentially we're calculating peak demands of the matches. So a peak demand is the most extensive period. So it's the most demanding period of a match. So the most distance a player will cover in any minute period. So it's a greater demand than just averaging across a match. So we need to make sure our players are prepared for those most demanding aspects of the game. And so part of that is actually being able to feed that back to coaches and practitioners. So on the screen now, you can see an example of an infographic that we've shared with all the clubs and staff within the project, and that's also been socialized more widely as well. But it's an overview of exactly what we found and how practitioners can use it in terms of practical recommendations. So, for example, across all of the matches that we've collected data, we calculated in terms of the players, what's the most extensive period of the match for them. So, for example, it's 166 meters per minute is the most extensive 1 minute period that a player, a WSL Academy player, will experience during a match. So, are we preparing those players for those sort of demands in training? Practitioners can then use this information to prescribe ball drill intensities. So they can use reference values, which are the values that we've presented on the screen there, for example, and they can use those to evaluate the intensities of the drills they are prescribing within training. So what we have done, and it's not on the screen right now, but we have an equation which uses this data. So drill practitioners can just input, let's say they want a 4.5 minute drill, and they want that 4.5 minute drill to be prescribed at match intensity. They can type in the numbers and it will give them what the peak match intensity should be for that drill. Now, practitioners won't want that for every single drill because you've got some drills you want to have low intensity, such as your technical drills, but there's other drills that should be high intensity. So we're trying to push that up for practitioners. So hopefully it gives them that reference that they can use. And then on this slide here, what we can see is that in a bit more detail. So the next step and what I'm analysing at the minute is actually currently are training drills preparing players for match intensity. Overall, we found that training is less demanding than match play, and ball drills do not replicate match intensity. So on the graph, the red is match intensity and the green is training intensity for each drill type. So you can see quite clearly there that none of the drills replicate match intensity for our WSL Academy players. So that links to our performance problem, which was how can we optimize the progression and physical development of our elite players? And firstly, we need to try and enable them to be prepared for those match intensities in training, which currently isn't happening in terms of the physical aspects.
Okay, that's a lot for me to translate, but I'll try. طبعا الملخص can you go back please to the طيب. طبعا شو اليوم احنا جمعنا البيانات هاي شو استفدنا منها؟ تم اخذ بعين الاعتبار اللي هي البيك اللي هو اعلى معدل انا اليوم بوصل له في المباراه خلال الدقيقه الواحده. ان كان مثلا اللي هي عندنا البيك ديستانس كفرت للدقيقه مقارنه بالزمن وجدوا انه هو تقريبا 166. فالفكره وين؟ انه انا اعمل محاكاه اثناء التمارين لاوصل للبيك هذا. ممكن أن يكون التمرين عندي 4 دقائق 5 دقائق، بس هل أنا اليوم عم بوصل لمحاكاة للمباراة إن كانت في جوانب اللي هي تسارع التباطؤ، في جوانب سبرنت، في المسافة المقطوعة للدقيقة. فإذا أنا بعمل مثلا في الدقيقة مش في معناته أنا بدي أقسمها على تمرين أشوف أنا هل وصل المرحلة هاي أو لا. الأمر الآخر اللي هو نكست سلايد، قارنوا خلينا نقول حالات معينة في المباراة وقارنوها في التمارين اللي بتتم، وجدوا إنه في فرق شاسع بين ارقام المباراه وارقام اللي هي مثلا 1v1 خلينا نقول اللي هي البوزيشننج. وجدوا انه التمارين اقل بكثير من كارقام من الحقائق اللي بتتم بالمباراه. فاذا انا بدي ارفع البرفورمانس او بدي احسن مستوى اللاعبين يجب محاكاه مباراه اثناء التمارين وارفع مستواها. طبعا كل مدرب اليوم في هذا البرنامج بيروح بس عندهم بنوا قاعده بيانات، وهي ان شاء الله نحن واحده من الشغلات اللي نشتغل فيها. بتروح مثلا بتحط انا اليوم بدي بوزيشننج، شو اذا حطيت تمرين بيعطيك البيك وبيعطيك الافرج. فانت كمدرب صرت تعرف انت لوين بدك توصل في التمرين وتحسن من التمارين بتاعتك توصل للمرحله اللي هي مش فرضها، عم بيعطيك اياها هو كمعلومه. نحن اليوم عم نشتغل بدون خلينا نقول بوصل. اذا ما عندك بوصل ما بتعرف توصل. فالهدف هو بناء قاعده بيانات بتروح على كل فئه عمريه، نوع التمرين بيقول لك شو البيك والاوف بيك او عفوا الافرج لكل تمرين.
But thank you, Naomi. And I suppose just to summarize your talk, it'd be good to hear where you feel like the FA will be moving forward and how to help support like answering those performance questions within helping the youth players bridge that gap between the senior players.
Yeah, so in terms of the FA and our findings, I think it's key in terms of coach education around how they design drills. So making sure that we are manipulating the intensity of the drill, not just changing the volume of the drill, and targeting specific drills for that as well. We found that obviously extensive small-sided games and technical drills is where players spend the most time within training. So perhaps targeting those drills to make sure the players are prepared for the demands of the game. We have to be aware that the demands of the women's game are increasing every year. And so the research needs to continue because we can't just prepare them for the current demands. We need to prepare our youth players for the future demands of the game. And those demands are only getting faster. So it's important that we continue the research and recycle the process going forwards, but educating coaches and making it digestible for them as well is important.
اوكي، طبعا الملخص اليوم شو خلينا نقول اهم خلينا نقول المقترحات. اولا زياده شده التمارين اثناء خلينا نقول القصص التدريبيه لوضع اكبر محاكاه لوضع المباراه. كل ما انت زدت الانتنسيتي او شده التمرين كل ما اعطيت خلينا نقول قوه او قوه للاعب واعطيته جرعه اضافيه اكبر. الوقت عامل الوقت مش الاساس، الانتنسيتي انا اليوم كيف اقدر اعطي بيك اوصل في خلال التمرين. الامر الاخر اللي هي بتقول انه اليوم بالنسبه لهم لكره القدم النسائيه في انجلترا في تطور، استمراريه اي مشروع هي الاساس. فاليوم هن مكملين لانه السنه عندنا اليوم نقول اعلى معدل اليوم او اعلى نتائج اليوم، غدا غير، السنه الجايه غير. فحيصير لازم كونتينيوتي او تكمله العمل بمشروع وليس الاقتصار على فتره قصيره وخلينا نقول الانتقال للمرحله الاخرى. We need to move to next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, thank you very much, Naomi. Appreciate your time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Naomi.
We move to Gerard. بس عمر بدي
So,
اوضح نقطه بخصوص التمرين والمحاكاه تبع المباراه. يفتقد اللاعب العربي خاصه بالمهنيين الحافز دائما في التمرين، والسبب الرئيسي تحصل في الفرق كبير. الحافز في المباراه ان في خصم لو عنده اراده الفوز. الحافز في التمرين هو جالس ياخذ تعليمات ممله في التدريب، يعني عامل مش عامل بدني مثل
هو عامل نفسه بالنسبه له. بس هذا اللي بغيت اوضحه. ما معنى ان التمرين المدرب ما يبغى يوصل للمحاكاه، لكن عقليه اللاعب فيه تحكم.
Any, is that a question for me?
No, that's
Okay,
yeah.
no problem. Thank you, Naomi. Appreciate your
Thank you,
time.
Naomi.
So,
And hope to see you in Dubai soon.
yeah.
Perfect. So, please can you provide an overview of your background, your education and professional experiences?
Okay, so education, I did a BSc back in, I think I graduated in about 2003, it was, in sports science. I followed that up with an MSc in sport physiology at John Moores University in about 2004, 2005. I have a professional doctorate in exercise or sport and exercise science, which was specifically in the area of rehabilitation in professional football. BASE is accredited, done some recent studies through Oxford Business School, specifically on leading strategic projects. From a practical and working perspective, I've worked in football for 18 years, under 13 managers, 750 plus games at all levels of the football pyramid. Worked in every competition in Europe and at home. Probably spent the last kind of 13 years around the Premier League with Liverpool and Aston Villa, and had a 3-year spell in between that at Glasgow Rangers. So pretty well rounded, good experience, domestically at least.
Oh, incredible. Thank you. So kind of moving on from that, who have been your main influences throughout your career and how did they go about problem solving?
Okay, I'd say early on, the people who, first of all, John McEwan, who's head of academy sports science at Everton, was the person who basically allowed me to get into the industry. So I leaned on John quite a bit early on. And then Paul Balsam was my boss at Leicester for a couple of years. Paul was, someone who I still speak to today. I worked with Paul pretty much 15 years ago. At the time, he was well known. He's equally as well known now. He was very innovative, a future thinker, really deep and thoughtful and rational around his processes. Maybe not more recently, but I spent 3 years working with Darren Burgess at Liverpool, who was, a great mentor for me. To this day, I speak to Darren regularly. His reputation is well known. He was, again, very innovative, very collaborative. From a problem-solving standpoint, difficult to give specific cases, but his wealth of experience, and use of technology and understanding of working in different sports, whether it be AFL, football, domestic, international, I think that provided him with a really well-rounded understanding of sport and team sports, and was able to lean on those experiences to deal with specific cases that were potentially challenging. So whether that be a recurring injury with a player, how we would get involved with that to help support that process, thinking bigger picture, being innovative, but also involving the group within that process. A lot of the time, that involves technology and the use of being objective and understanding where individuals are and where you want them to get to. So that probably a brief example of some of his skill sets and how he went about solving problems without specifically giving an exact case.
Brilliant, thanks for that. So next question, given your previous roles, what have been the biggest performance difficulties or problems that you have faced?
I've gone from very early days being a generalist. You know, when I started back in 2005, I think it was now, I was basically an N of one when it comes to a department. So I was the fitness coach, I was the SFE coach, I was the nutritionist, I was a psychologist, I was the data scientist. You know, even though we never necessarily had all those roles, you were doing elements of those roles. And then you move to Liverpool and my role became very specific as a rehabilitation fitness coach. So I had to learn a very novel role within, you know, the Premier League. It was an Australian model. And even though rehabilitation takes place every day at football clubs, this model was very specific in terms of, you know, it was my responsibility to, you know, to manage exercise and physical activity for those players. So you become very focused in a small area. And then moving to Glasgow Rangers and moving into a head of performance role, and then move away from being that specialist and that subject matter expert to being a little bit more of a generalist again, overseeing a department of people which was new and different, you know, trying to develop and build a department to support the club's vision. So I've kind of gone through a journey of generalist with, you know, trying to do many different facets of the roles that are involved in football clubs, moving to a very specialist role, working within a team of, you know, probably 15 plus people, then moving to a more management role where I'm overseeing a team of, at the outset, quite small, but we needed to build that rapidly and scale it up rapidly to ensure that we had, you know, the support staff and the infrastructure to align ourselves with what the club's vision was, which was to become, you know, the number one team in Scotland during our time there. So definitely different types of performance challenges across the spectrum, depending on the role that I was undertaking. Matt, you're on mute. Didn't hear any of that, sorry.
I'll go again. Just going directly on from kind of that last answer is how did you go about solving those issues that you faced kind of throughout your career within those different departments, and, you know, working on your own to then moving into a big team?
I suppose moving, you know, going from being what I would class as a subject matter expert into a bit more of a generalist role was, even though I had what I would deem as the skills to understand all those areas in terms of medical science, you know, fitness, injury, all these things, that I've been living in that world quite extensively. When you're then out there and you have to essentially come from behind the microscope and get away from the minor details or the real finer details and almost get onto the telescope, and you're a bit more of a from afar vision. You know, that was difficult. That was a tough learning curve. You know, I think people who've probably been in my role previously you find yourself in these leadership roles which are different. They're very different, and you know you have to upskill quickly. And what you were probably what got you into that position was probably the role you did when you were a subject matter expert, and then you move into these leadership roles and they're very, very different. So it was about, you know, trying to work with a team of people, you know, get them working collaboratively, working cohesively towards, you know, a common aim. one of the challenges I had was staying up to speed with technology, because you've got a lot of moving parts and a lot of spinning plates. So I may not have had the finer details of using certain types of tech, but we were very keen to ensure that we weren't behind the curve, and we had the latest technology in whatever area it was to help us, provide the best services to our players. So my role was kind of partly to evaluate what tech was out there, and what could help us, without necessarily being, at the forefront delivering on that. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview of some of the challenges of transferring from being, a classic kind of subject matter expert to evolving into more of a performance management role.
Brilliant, thank you. You've kind of drawn out a bit there towards the end of that answer as well, but what was the role of technology in finding solutions to the issues that you faced?
I can probably give an example from my time at Liverpool, which was when I was rehabilitation fitness coach. We had a change of manager. It's probably pretty obvious who it was, but we went from one manager to a new manager, and with that change in management came a huge turnaround in physical outputs of the team. So we went from pretty much the team performing at one level to within a week or two later, after an international break, we got a new manager, and the physical outputs based on the technical demands that the coach wants how he wants to play, resulted in huge changes, and those huge changes unfortunately resulted in an injury. Now we had a ton of information from match tracking and training information of GPS, and it was our role to minimize this risk as much as possible. So one of the things we did was to look at the changes on an individual level across all the positions. Now some of these players had 300% changes in sprint distance, for instance. Then even though two players may have had a very similar increase in physical output, that probably didn't come at the same risk from one player to another. So it was about being strategic in terms of who we tried to protect as much as possible. So even though we've got these massive game demand changes, and the team outputs have have gone up by 10 kilometers for total distance and X amount for high speed, when you drill down into the individuals, some of them are having really significant changes, but there's maybe only 2 or 3 of those individuals who, we can't change everyone and we can't protect everyone. Not everyone can be rotated out of games and managed through training. So we had to kind of be selective in who we wanted to manage and how we wanted to manage. So we had to be quite diligent with that and detailed. So we used the game tracking information, the training information, how those players were responding from a physical perspective through some of the screening that was in place. But then be selective in the individuals who we gave the information to the manager about, to manage those, or try and manage those. And then on top of that, how do we then protect them further, around recovery strategies, around what their pre-training and post-training SSC work look like. Can we be creative in that and not add further stress? We know the most important thing is they've got to play football, they've got to train, they've got to play. So, we have to make further amendments in terms of the stress that was being placed on them. And sometimes that meant taking work out entirely. Sometimes that meant being a bit more creative and dampening it down. Sometimes it meant changing the modality of it from an eccentric, for instance, to an isometric. And then sometimes it meant having a greater focus on recovery. They're probably some of the ways which we've kind of used tech and being collaborative in our approach to support them.
Brilliant, thank you. So you provide like a really kind of nice overview of how you use tech at Liverpool. Would it be possible for you to provide a more kind of specific case study of how you've used technology to overcome a specific issue, for example, or to track something that maybe you weren't aware of or didn't do beforehand?
Yeah. So following the lockdown, we had at Rangers we had the longest lockdown of all. So our players were almost 100 days from the last game to recommencing training. So we didn't have a restart of our league, and we were delayed in our return. So when we were coming back from our return, we engaged with Playermaker for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we were quite worried about some of the players. Not everyone, but because we had players scattered around the world, they had different restrictions, they had different capabilities of being able to perform exercise. Some had access to equipment, some never, some couldn't leave the house, some could. So we had a vast array of individuals with different challenges. And some of those players hadn't kicked the ball for 3 months. So we were really mindful when we were coming back that, we have GPS, we can monitor, movement and locomotion, but we weren't very good at being able to understand that, the technical side and, passing, number of passes, intensity of those passes. And the first few weeks of our return to training was non-contact in small groups, which ultimately meant probably more contacts of the ball. And we knew there was going to be an eagerness from the coaches to want to get on the balls, which is absolutely understandable. So we are quite concerned at the outset. So we engaged with Playermaker, and we utilise Playermaker for all our training sessions throughout pre-season. The tech provided us with some really valuable information around, the number of contacts left and right. It allowed us to be a little bit more periodized in how we built the contacts over the course of 2-3 weeks to ensure that we didn't overload or try to ensure that we didn't overload players after an extensive layoff. One of the other ways we used Playermaker was we did some submax running assessments, a 30-15, an amended version of the 30-15. Now classically we'd just be using heart rate response to a given dose of work. Now what we had here was Playermaker, so we were able to gain some further insights, and one of the metrics we looked at was contact time from Playermaker. So we performed the test beginning, middle and end of pre-season, and then we were able to run some analysis, some training load analysis, and look at some dose responses. So on top of gaining heart rate responses, which we were pretty confident we knew we were going to improve our internal response to that given bout of work, on the back of performing 6 weeks of pre-season training. But we weren't too sure what we were going to get from Playermaker. But what we saw was improvements in contact time. So the players were more efficient in the movement. And through some training load analysis, we saw that this was strongly linked to the high speed running the players performed and the high speed efforts that they performed. Now, what that provided us with was a framework for the following pre-season to understand if we are to get through a certain amount of volume and intensity, we are quite likely to make various changes in performance, internally and externally, through heart rate and contact times. And people will say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the players have a better aerobic capacity to deal with the demands of training and playing. And from a locomotion standpoint, they're more efficient and essentially quicker. That they can deal with that workload better. So when we're going through high training volumes and repeated games, which is what we had to do at Rangers, we had an understanding that our players were better prepared for those demands.
That's great, thank you. Thanks for going into that amount of detail as well. really
Okay.
interesting. Moving on to kind of the last question now. So how has technology influenced your practice throughout your career?
Massively. You know, I'm a very objective individual. You know, I like to use tech and objective measures to help support decision making and programming. Well, first and foremost, we need tech that's valid and reliable. You know, so that's our first thing. And ideally, we need it to be as, you know, as less invasive as possible. You know, so there's more and more tech coming out now. You know, whether that be around match tracking, you know, whether it be motion analysis. You know, the likes of Player Maker, which combines that and technical element. You know, you have, you know, a lot of detailed technology for the gym, whether it be again motion capture systems, you know, kinetic, kinematic information. You know, then we have, you know, data platforms of where all this information's housed, and then it can be processed through AI, which, you know, can again, you know, support decision making. So, you know, tech is fundamental to elite sport. But we have to first and foremost make sure that, you know, what the systems we're using are valid and reliable, and then, you know, be selective in what we use as well, because there's so much tech out there. You know, be selective in what you use, and don't just, you know, don't jump on board, you know, the first thing that becomes available. You know, be critical, understand, you know, where there might be gaps in your program and how tech can support those gaps, and find, you know, the best system that suits, you know, the question you want to answer or where you think the gaps are, and ensure that, you know, what it says it does, it actually does, and it's valid and reliable. You're on mute, mate.
Thanks a lot for your time. Can you hear me now? Okay, might be the signal.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I can hear you, Matthew. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. So, just want to say thank you for your time. I'm sure the answers have provided a lot of value to the people that will be seeing the video over in Dubai. So, yeah, thanks a lot for that. And yeah, I hope all the best, and hope everything goes well.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I'll give Steve a message. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the invite.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome to Steve Barrett, who is the Director of Sports Science and Research Innovation at Playmaker. He's going to be answering performance questions around technology in youth football. So, Steve, question 1. How do you define and design performance questions within youth football?
So first of all, I'd like to thank the Dubai Sports Council for putting on the event, along with High Talent and Omar. So coming back to your question, Matt, ultimately, like when we start to shape performance questions and trying to help apply in technology within youth football, we need to make sure that we're answering relevant questions for those organisations and making sure that those questions are aligned across different members of the club. So, for example, a question that board members and technical directors might have in the club might be different to the people on the ground who are working with the players day in and day out. And so what we need to make sure is which questions are there to be answered, who takes responsibility for answering those questions, and how do we really dive that little bit deeper into being as specific as possible? Because the more specific we can be with like question and answers, then we can get some better outcomes as well. I suppose when we think about the different approaches that you can take with asking questions, I always come back to a player-centered approach. When we look at the player at the heart of it, which ultimately a player playing football on the pitch is why we all tend to be involved in football, is ultimately understanding what does that player need, how do we go about measuring it, how do we go about answering questions that are going to help improve the player or reduce their risk of injury to keep them on the pitch. and who are going to be the key stakeholders that can help us in answering that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So moving on from that, is there anything specific about youth players you consider when defining performance questions?
So one of the important things is understanding how complex youth football players are. And when we look back at some of the youth development models that have been delivered, so this is an example from some researchers in the UK that look at when you should utilize certain activities to help develop players as well. And this model has been adopted in football. So where there is 3 S's, this stands for sport-specific curriculum in order, or sport-specific skills, sorry, in order to help develop football skills. Whereas when we look around it, we know that actually before the age of like 9, actually it should be a generalist model. So depending on the age of the youth footballer, and if we focus on that 9 to 16, 17, 18-year-old phase, we know that there's got to be a hybrid model of looking after players from a sport-specific element, but still focusing on those key underlying athletic traits, for example. So to give an example, if we have a youth footballer and they just focus purely on football skills, then actually we're not allowing the potential growth and adaptation of them from an athletic perspective, which will ultimately help within that sport-specific environment as well.
Perfect. And who do you involve in that process?
So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of key people that can be involved in the process. And this goes back to the very aims of the club. And the question starts at the board level. What do they want to achieve? Are they a developing club? So they want first team youth players to be playing in the first team. Do they want players to be developed, to be sold on? Or is the academy there in order to facilitate the first team? So once we know that question, we can then understand further, okay, does this player need technical development as part of their individual learning development plan? Or do they need to focus more on the physical skills? Do they need to focus more on the technical, tactical understanding? And this is where we can lean on people such as technical coaches, performance analysts, or if we focus on the physical, head of performances, sports scientists, strength coaches. But actually, when all parties come together as part of a multidisciplinary team, we can really get a good model of support for the individual with the player at the center of those conversations as well.
And have you got any methods for adopting technology to answer these problems in the field? And can you give some examples of that as well?
Yeah, so I think one of the main models that I tend to use is for performance support is this like review, plan, act, track cycle. Because ultimately, like when you look at what performance staff do in order to support youth players or even senior players as well, you have to review what you've done previously. You then plan accordingly based upon the feedback you've got. And you then act upon that plan and then track it, see if it's a success. And ultimately, you go in that revolving cycle as well. So to give you an example from the field, we can basically look at the review process. So we have an example here of where individual player utilizing technology. So within this example, we have an automated video camera using AI technology to actually film a football match. So again, examples of this include your huddle cameras, your video cameras, your Pixlot cameras, Speedio, which then allows the automated video recording of this. Then we utilize coding technology such as sports code, Dartfish, Angles, Huddle. There's loads of different technology you can use in order to film, code, then analyze. And as part of this, the players are wearing foot-mounted inertial measurement units in order to automate some of the clips. And so we can review quickly and efficiently without much human resources. We can actually go ahead and monitor the player's ability to receive the ball on the turn. Are they receiving the ball with the back to goal? Are they able to play it on the half turn? Are they then in good positions to adopt it as well? So we still need the coaches element and the feedback. And even when we start to focus on the physical element, are they moving efficiently? It's the movement actions in the game that we can take and try to develop in training. And ultimately, that allows the players to then benchmark themselves. And another way to review data, as mentioned just there, is actually benchmarking. Now, where do we actually put youth players in order to help them benchmark as a goal to hit? How can we help them to overachieve on what they've met? So, for example, like in this one where the 2 youth players are circled at the bottom, we can give them targets on, okay, this is where you are now. As an under 18 or under 23 player, how do you then start to compete with the first team goalkeepers who are over on the left hand side, who they have quicker kicking speeds on average and also maximally? So it gives us a strategy to then go and work with them. Well, how do we go about doing this? How do we go about improving you? Because it might just happen over time, or how can we accelerate that as well? So within this review process, we've already started to think about the next planning stage as well. So within this example as well, coming back to some position-specific elements, and you can see now some examples. So in this top left-hand corner, we actually have an example of a position-specific drill for a wide midfielder, where the player, and I'll just play it singularly, where the player has to do, sorry, I'm just going back. I won't click on it again. So the player has to do some movements like they do in a match to then attack the ball, and you can include or exclude the ball depending on the coach's targets for that day. So for example, in these drills, they were physical-based drills where the head coach wanted to focus on the movement patterns that she wanted to work with the players. In the top right-hand corner, we have an example of a fullback where they've gone to close down a wide midfield player, come back to recover the position, and then they've done an overlapping run to cross the ball, and then a big recovery run. From a midfielder perspective, and you see how the position of these move in relation to the tactical element of the player's movement patterns. We have a central midfielder pressing different opponents to then attack and recover. Whereas with a forward, we have some movements to lose to the defender, check back in to receive the ball, play the ball back, then curve the run in behind to then shoot on goal. As I say, you can do this both with and without a ball, depending on the coach's philosophy. But in the next video clip, we'll see an example of where we've actually incorporated all elements of the multidisciplinary team to help support the achievements of a physical element and also the head coach's request of tactical movements incorporating conditioning. So starting to link all of them together. So we reviewed it, we planned it, and now this is us acting upon it as well. I apologize if the video is a little bit stuttery based upon the internet feed. But what we have here, this is actually our kit man on the camp, who after instructions from myself would help monitor and encourage the attackers to run the certain movement patterns. They would then make sure the next player goes and you see the checks, check back, lose the defender to then curve the run to make it in behind, which would time with the wide players crossing the ball in. And you can see some of the other movement patterns going on in the background. We then also have, again, I won't keep the video going too long, but this is an example of some footwork drills by the wide midfield players to attack down the wing, then cross the ball in where the attacker would be to receive it. So even though there is no ball involved, because of the tactical movement strategies that the coach wants to incur, which the head coach is here with some of the centre-backs, we have the physio here watching the wide midfield players, and me over there monitoring it all. We've incorporated the 4 corners of the coaching model, because it's technical movements, it's tactical strategies, it's physical conditioning, and the psychological element of everyone being involved together as well. And again, while this is an example of under 18 female players who some have recently won the European Championships, it's an element that you can incorporate in different levels that you adapt the plan according to the age groups and what the demands are of the game as well. And here's an example of the output. which again, this is very raw, and this is how the coach at the time wanted to track the competition of the players, who covered the most distance. Again, we did this, this was back in 2013, so we utilized GPS technology. How far did players run? Like, what's the high speed that they achieved during that? So in essence, if someone was able to run further and quicker during the 15 seconds of the position-specific movements that we planned, that was a better achievement for us on this basis. Were they able also to perform high-intensity actions? Because that might be more relevant for positions that were pressing, so like the centre midfielders and the defenders, and also the goalkeepers. But also were they able to slow down just as quick as well? And so not only did we have the benchmarks for the positions, we would also have a competition within players at the different age groups. So again, mainly 23s, 18s and 16s this was at the time, but we'd also be able to track improvement. If you were to do this every time you came on international camp, how well did you do as well? And then that concludes that model of track as well. And while we go on to, again, discuss further, there's different ways that you can adopt and look at technology as well in youth football players.
Brilliant, thank you. So you mentioned quite a few different types of tech there and how they were used, but how did you assess if that tech had an impact?
So I think it's looking at how, starting off from ultimately where the technology is and how did you come about incorporating it into your program. So this model is proposed by Johan Wint from the Vancouver Whitecaps as well. It's a really nice model whereby ultimately you don't always have to use technology. You should only use technology that answers a question. So this decision-making tree, would the promised information be helpful? Yes or no? Can you trust the information you'll be getting? So is it valid? Is it reliable? Can we rely upon it as practitioners to really give us the answers we want? Can you integrate it, manage it, and analyze the data effectively? Ultimately, you could have the richest data set in the world, but if you're not in a position to use it, then that's obviously an issue because then you're not utilizing everything. And the technology has to be useful. Can we actually use it in practice? If you have the most complex system in the world, which gives you everything, but then a coach or a practitioner can't use it in the field, it's useless. And so you have to answer all that as part of your decision making. And so to give you an example that was actually used as part of this framework, for me, when I was working as a practitioner, I would make sure that ultimately any technology we bring into the club has an impact at all levels. So this is an example of how we reviewed that the technology was useful. First of all, does it have an impact on what we were talking about? Like at first team level, okay, it can have an impact, but does it have impact on that youth level that we've been talking about? So for example, like when we look at the professional development phase, so 21s to 18s, and the YDP phase, if I can have a technology that can impact those age groups as well as the first team, that's a big tick for me as a practitioner. So this is all from one technology whereby actually monitoring technical loads can then be coincided with individual players' development plan from a technical perspective. So not only is, if we go back to those key stakeholders and the different staff members at the clubs, we have technical coaches being able to use the same technology as a sports scientist to get two different outcomes, but yet it's the same measures. We also have video analysts getting inputs as what physios are, but different processes. And then we also have board members able to make some good insights as well as like just utilizing technology for competition at the level to help with coaches. For me, this example shows an impact of how technology, when you pick the right technology for your organization, can have a big impact. Ultimately, if it gives you the answers, it can save human resource time, and it can be used across club, not just at first team level. Because youth development, there is different technology that can be used there, but if you have consistent technology, it can really make an impact for your program as well. And thank you for the time today, Matt. I appreciate you asking some questions as well.
No problem at all. Thanks, Steve, for some really insightful stuff there. And thank you, everyone. Enjoy listening to it.